Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hawaii International Real Estate Council special presentation today, Harpta, Firpta, and Escrow Issues for International Clientele. So happy that you could join us. My name is Patrick O'Neill. I'm the principal broker owner at Luxury Homes International, and here today as the president of the Hawaii International Real Estate Council. Just a quick disclaimer, the information today will just be general in nature and should not be considered as legal or tax advice of any kind. And you can see the rest of the disclaimer right there. Want to say thank you to all of the board members for the Hawaii International Real Estate Council, and in particular, the staff over at the Hawaii Association of Realtors, including Wendy Brown, Crystal Bise, and Courtney, our newest person in the control room today. So thank you to everyone and all your efforts throughout the year. And a warm welcome to all the members of the Hawaii International Real Estate Council that are joining us today. If you're not familiar with our group, we are a nonprofit group that coordinates educational events throughout the year, like the one you're attending today. And you can see a list of some of the things that are coming up this year. If you are not a member, please consider joining. It's only $30 for the year, and you have free access to events like this in this webinar. And in our live events, you have kind of a VIP access and sometimes discounted participation. If you are a guest joining us today, and I know there's quite a few, you've paid $10 to be here today, we got a deal for you. Just add another $20 to that, and you'll have full membership for the year, and all the rest of these webinars will be completely free. Wendy is going to put her contact information in the chat. If you're interested in taking advantage of that, please contact her directly. So just another $20, you're a full member of the Hawaii International Real Estate Council. You'll also have full access to our library, which is members-only library of all our recordings, like the one today. So you can go back and access. It's a great resource. I find myself going back quite often. And coming up next month, we have a really special speaker. If you heard him last year, you know how interesting this guy is, Matt Christopherson. He works in Washington, D.C. with Lawrence Yoon at the National Association of Realtors. He has amazing data and statistics. He's going to come and talk about buyer and seller profiles across the country, but also specific for Hawaii. And he does a special profiling of international clientele. He'll also give us a little bit of a market update about what's happening in real estate. It's a great one. You don't want to miss it. That's next month, March 15th. You can contact Wendy, you can contact myself, anyone if you're interested in attending that. And finally, if you've ever thought about getting your certified international property specialist, Ron Phipps is considered one of the best instructors in the country. He's going to be here live in Honolulu in just a couple of weeks. And then he has a whole slate of webinar classes for the remaining requirements for the CIPS. It's a great designation. And I can tell you, especially in the Pacific Rim, this is one of the few designations that anyone knows what it means. This is a really, really good one. If you're interested, again, contact Wendy, you can contact myself, and we'll get you set up with that. And a huge thank you to our sponsor, Guaranteed Rate. Without their support for this particular event today and all the other ones throughout the year, we simply couldn't do it. And we have a familiar face probably to everyone, Mr. Leonard Loventhal. Leonard, are you there?
Well, I'm here. Let's see.
We don't see you yet. We hear you.
How's
there
that?
You are. All right. Perfect.
Thank you, Patrick. It's always nice to be in front of the group and to share a little bit about the market. And we have a giveaway this morning. So basically, the interest rates are still an issue. From the fourth quarter of last year to the beginning of this year, we finally got a bit of a break. We went from, say, the mid-sevens on a 30-year fix into the mid-sixes. It was a 1% drop, which was very helpful, but still not near where we were a few years ago. If you do a VA or FHA loan, you can probably get into the lower sixes. And of course, on a conventional financing, if you have a large down payment, excellent credit, you can probably get into the high fives right now. And we are seeing a lot more incentives coming from the sellers at this point, as opposed to the dropping of their sales prices, their list prices. So different market right now, but that all leads to my thought for today is we are no longer in a market where the rates were so amazing that everybody had a chance. Right now, there's still a lot of buyers out there, but there are a lot of home buyer people that want to get in that are no longer in the game right now, and they need to prepare. So I would say the best thing to do right now, aside from working with your clients, is go back and check over people who were interested before the rate bump and go back and revisit, talk to them, get them to a loan officer, get them certified to buy when rates do come down a little or when their income goes up. So it's now is the best time. And loan officers, unfortunately, we're not that busy because there is no refinancing going on. So right now, great time to prep your clients that wanted to buy but are no longer quite in the game right now. And that would be my best advice. And later on today, we're going to put, there's a QR code on the screen. We've got a nice gift to give away. We're going to do it virtually. So scan it, put in your information. We'll do a drawing. We're going to leave it up even after, because we're virtual, we can do a lot of different things. We're going to leave it up after the presentation. And if you need additional information, just text me. I'll put my information up in the chat. And you can also email me if you forget to scan the QR code right now. But thanks again for all of your business, your support. We look forward to an amazing year. Happy Year of the Dragon. Back to you, Patrick. Thank you.
Thanks, Leonard. Thank you very much. Yeah, good advice. We certainly do appreciate all of that. Okay, we're going to move on to, before we do that, if you have any questions, and the speakers really like those because it gives an idea what you're really interested in, please drop those in the Q&A box here, and we'll pull those out. If you put something in the chat, we'll also be able to get that as well. You'll be receiving a survey after the presentation. It take about 2 minutes. If you take a moment just to fill that out. And there will be a video presentation for all the HIRIC members. So again, if you don't have that membership, make sure you get that. You'll have access to this video right after it comes out. Okay, so our first speaker, Brad Konishi, has been a CPA since 2001. And Brad, I didn't know this. I just saw that you were the controller for the Honolulu Board of Realtors for a while. It's kind of interesting. And Brad is a total expert, and you may have taken his class, which is called Residential Real Estate Tax Rules, 1031 Exchange, and Foreign Investors. He is an absolute pro. I've had the pleasure of working with him on Harpta and Firpta refunds. Please join me in a warm virtual welcome for Mr. Brad Konishi. Brad.
Hey, thanks, Patrick. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Yeah, you might have remembered me. If you took a GRI class sometime between 2004 and 2021, you might have remembered a long nap, a 6-hour nap that you had. That was my class. It's an accounting class. So anyway, I'm going to talk about Harpta and Firpta, but I've given this presentation before. So what I've done this time is I've kind of pared it down to some things that I thought, need to be emphasized, because we've heard it a lot throughout the year. And then also a few more updates about, especially about Firpta, which has been historically, at least within the last several years, a real problem area. So let me start my presentation. Okay, here we go. Harpta, Firpta updates for 2024. So disclaimer, Patrick gave a nice disclaimer. This is just for discussion purposes only. This is not tax advice. Visit a tax professional to see, for advice that may be applied to your circumstances or your client's circumstances. So, this is something that needs to be reemphasized. Harpta and as well as Firpta, they are withholdings, not taxes. And I know a lot of times when your client sees the number on their sheet, it's a really, really large number, and it can be frightening to see this large number that's usually on the bottom end somewhere around $40,000 and can go up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. But just emphasize to them that this is not a tax, this is a withholding. And the difference is that a withholding is an amount that the government takes and they set aside for the pot in the in the possibility that you'll have future taxes owed. So the money that's withheld for Harpta is going to be used for one of two things. It's either going to be used to pay your tax liability, or it's going to be refunded to you. So just remember that. Don't panic. Second thing is, a lot of times, especially when we're on the subject of Harpta and Firpta, a lot of investors have it in their mind that Hawaii hates investors. And I've heard that more than once. Hawaii hates investors. You guys tax us more than the rest of you residents. But that's not true. Actually, all things being equal, a Hawaii resident and a Hawaii non-resident will pay the same amount of tax on the same amount of gain. The only difference between taxation for a Hawaii resident versus a Hawaii non-resident is that a Hawaii non-resident only pays income tax on their Hawaii-sourced income, whereas Hawaii residents, you and I and all of our, well, not all, our family and friends who live here, we get taxed on our worldwide income as Hawaii residents. So the state of Hawaii taxes on our worldwide income, whereas non-residents only on their Hawaii-sourced income. So who is a resident person, right? That's the biggest question, question for Harpta, also a question for Firpta. Who is a resident person? So, the individual or entity that is deemed to be a resident person is allowed an immediate waiver of Harpta via the N-289. And so that's one of the benefits of being a resident person, right? You don't need to jump through any hoops. You just check a little box when you go into escrow, and that will give you an immediate waiver as a resident. The only residency status that matters to the state of Hawaii is your residency status on the date that you actually close your sale. So somebody might have been a resident for a very, very, very long time, but if they aren't a resident on the date that they close their sale, technically Harpta should apply. Harpta individuals can report their residency on Form N-289. Once again, this is a form that your clients receive, the sellers will receive when they go into contract. Couple of things, it's not always individuals that are selling real estate. Sometimes it's entities that are selling real estate. So keep in mind that entities that are registered to do business in Hawaii are generally allowed to claim residency for an immediate Harpta waiver. So what that means is not only does the entity need to be, have some kind of documentation to show its existence, but they'd also need to be registered with the DCCA. And if they have that registration, they may be allowed to get an immediate Harpta waiver. The exception to this rule are sole proprietorships or single member LLCs that are taxed as sole proprietorships. These types of entities, even if they're registered with the DCCA, aren't automatically allowed to claim residency. Really, what matters for entities of this type is the residency of the owner. So just keep that in mind. Resident estate. Sometimes people hold real estate when they pass away. When they pass away and they don't have a trust, what is created is something called an estate. So what defines a resident estate from a non-resident estate? What are the differences? Well, the estate of a decedent who was a resident at the time of death is a resident estate if a court appoints a personal representative or administrator to carry on, and who does carry on the principal or ancillary administration of the estate. So in other words, a lot of words, meaning that if somebody was a Hawaii resident and they don't have a trust and then they pass away holding the real estate, their estate is going to be considered to be a Hawaii resident. So a benefit. However, sometimes people have a trust. A lot of times when people own real estate in a trust, it's held in a revocable trust until that person passes away. Then once that person passes away, the trust becomes irrevocable. And so what is a resident trust? Who is allowed to get an immediate Harpta waiver as opposed to somebody who might need to have Harpta withheld and then apply for a refund? Well, a trust is considered a resident trust if there are 3 bullet points. If the first bullet point applies, they can consider themselves to be a resident trust. So if the administration of the trust is carried on wholly in the state of Hawaii, then it's a resident trust. But if that doesn't apply, then the fiduciaries, the trustees, if they are residents, domestic corporations, or partnerships formed under Hawaii law, if those fiduciaries are residents, and then you would be considered to be a resident trust. However, if the first two bullet points don't apply, then you look at the third bullet point, which is the administration of the trust is partly carried on in the state if one half or more of the fiduciaries are residents, domestic corporations, or partnerships formed under Hawaii law. So, it's one of the three. If one of the three applies, then the resident trusts might be able to get an immediate Harpta waiver by just checking the box on the N289. Easy. Let me jump into Firpta, and I'm going to take some questions afterwards. I know I'm moving kind of fast on this, but questions about Firpta. Firpta, is like Harpta is a acronym, stands for the Foreign Real Property Tax Act. Here's the thing that's interesting about Firpta. Most people assume that Firpta is going to be 15%. And you know what? In 95% of the transactions that we see, Firpta is 15%. Any home that is sold for above $1 million, Firpta rate is automatically 15%. However, homes that are being sold between 300,000 and $1 million, if the buyer agrees to occupy the home for at least 50% of the entire time over the next year that the home is occupied, the seller might be able to reduce that withholding from 15% down to 10%. And then once again, if the sales price is less than 300,000 and the buyer makes those promises to occupy the home for that 50% of the time, then it can be as low as 0%. But for all intents and purposes, it's probably best to think about Firpta as being 15%. You know what? Before I move on to the next, let me answer this question by Mickey Yim. She says, what about property in joint tenancy with uncle and his niece? Does she have to do a 50% Harpta? So, Mickey, maybe if you got your fingers ready, who's the resident and who's not the resident? Is the uncle of the resident and the niece not a resident? Is that the situation? Oh, okay. You know what? I'll hold the questions to the end, and I'll answer those questions at the end. Let me just continue forward with the Firpta. 0, 15, 10, or 15%, almost always 15%. So who is a foreign person? A foreign person is, the statutes for Firpta say that a foreign person is going to be subject to Firpta. So the IRS definition of foreign person is a non-resident alien individual, a foreign corporation that has not made a specific election under the Internal Revenue Code to be treated like a domestic type of individual or domestic type of entity, excuse me. It does not include resident alien individuals. So what is a resident alien? And this is this is something that is worthy of noting if you have international clients. Green card test. To keep a green card, you must not make your primary home in another country. So if somebody holds a green card, they are not going to be subject to Firpta if they sign an affidavit that they receive during the escrow process, during the closing process. Also, too, this is something that's really interesting, and I'm going to read this. I'm going to read this slowly because this is a test that a seller may be able to pass and be able to get an immediate waiver of Firpta, once again, if they sign an affidavit attesting to this fact. The substantial presence test applies to people who have spent a number of days under certain types of visas, I should add. Even without having a green card, a person who spends 31 days in the United States during the current year and at least 183 days during the 3-year period that includes the current year and the 2 years immediately before that is considered to be a resident alien. So the substantial presence test is something that somebody might be able to lean on and pass, even though they might not have a green card. One thing, and this is something that is really, really important with your international sellers, is the ITIN, the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. So Foreign persons who need to file for a Harpta or Firpta waiver, withholding certificate, reduction, or early refund. They need to have an SSN, an ITIN, or they need to have proof that they've at least applied for one, and that proof would be in the form of a copy of the application, the W-7 that they need to file. So in order to get an ITIN, a taxpayer would need to apply for one with the IRS or one of their representatives. If they don't want to send their tax documents by mail, the applicant must visit someone called an acceptance agent in person to actually show them the documents, the acceptance agent is going to, review. So the acceptance agent is a person that is licensed by the IRS to inspect identification documents and to complete an application to obtain an ITIN. So for the last couple of years, for about the last 2 or 3 years, the IRS had suspended this acceptance agent program. I think in 2021, they suspended it. And so, and they only suspended it because the IRS were severely short-staffed over the last several years. And so, because of that, they had shut this program down, but they just opened this program again in January of 2024. And so I'm actually thinking about possibly filing for the license to be an acceptance agent. So we'll see. We'll see. That program good has reopened. So Harpta, Harpta.com. You can reach us at Harpta.com. Really easy to remember. I just recently took a look at our 2023 numbers, and I found that for 2023, we've done Harpta waivers of over $7 million, a little over $7 million, and we've gotten Harpta refunds of almost $6 million for our clients. So yeah, though that is my presentation. Let me go ahead and stop the share.
Brad, thank you. Thank you very much. And I know we had contacted you for a processing of an exemption and one time for a refund. What's the approximate cost if it's just a normal standard vanilla type thing?
Okay, yeah. So if somebody is getting a waiver of Harpta, it's going to be $900 is our starting base fee. A little bit more if they acquired the property through an inheritance, because an inheritance requires a little bit more documents to review and present. And also too, we can do reductions. Reductions are allowed if you're ever in a real tight spot where your seller is being told by escrow that they need to bring cash to closing just to be able to close. So in that case, if Harpta is layered on that transaction and it's causing that the seller to actually have to bring cash to closing, we can get that reduced. So it's about $900 is our base fee. For early refunds, our base fee starts at $1,000 for the first person on title, an additional $500 for each additional person on title needing the Harpta refund.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then we're going to do Q&A at the end after Jeremy's presentation. We've got a bunch of questions coming in, so we'll try to get to everybody's questions.
Okay, cool.
Okay. And Brad, thank you. And as I said before, I've called Brad. I've used him. He's phenomenal. Highly recommend. Rather than trying to remember all the things he just said, just call him up, and then he'll make sure he takes care of that. Okay, let's go back here. Sorry, 1 second. And okay, let's righty. Okay, all right. And our next speaker may be well known to many of you, Jeremy Trueblood. He has been at Title Guarantee for 20 years. He's a vice president. He's also the manager of the commercial division. Also a great resource for all questions. Escrow. Jeremy, you there? There you are.
Yep.
And there you are. All right. Okay. So welcome, Jeremy. Thank you very much. You want to pull up your PowerPoint?
Sure. Thank you for having me today. Let's see if I can share it. There we go. All right. Again, yeah, thank you very much for having me today. Today, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about how Escrow can partner with you and help you on your journey to a successful escrow closing, especially with foreign buyers or sellers, because there's a couple little hurdles and things that we can talk about that might help you with some tricks of the trade that I can share with, as Patrick mentioned, my 20 years of experience in escrow. I've kind of seen a lot of different scenarios play out, so I'd be happy to share some of those with you today. So just a quick overview. Again, our role in escrow and title. So title and escrow kind of partner together with you to facilitate the escrow transaction. Escrow is just essentially a neutral third party, as you know. We're holding the funds and documents. From a title standpoint, they're the ones who are actually issuing the policy and preparing a title report for you. The reason I bring up title is some of the things I'll talk about today actually pertain to title and things that you might see on the title report. So even though I'm an escrow officer, I'll speak a little bit to how the issuing on title will work with you to resolve some of those things. And again, so title, preparing the title report, offering solutions to help resolve any title issues, and then ultimately we'll issue a title insurance policy to your buyer. So from an escrow standpoint, we realize that there's a lot of foreign clients that we work with. We do have some basic opening letters I guess, translated into Japanese, Korean, and 2 forms of Chinese. So what I would suggest is if you have particular clients that may benefit from this, just reach out to your escrow officer when opening the escrow transaction. We'd be happy to provide them with the specific opening packets that are tailored specifically to them. And then also within our company, we have some escrow officers that are fluent in particular languages. You may have already partnered with them. If you happen to know that your client speaks Japanese, you might use one of our Japanese speaking escrow officers. So that's just something that we do to kind of facilitate the transaction, make it a little bit easier for the client, and of course help them complete the opening paperwork. The opening paperwork is very important to get back to escrow as quickly as possible to address any issues on title and or address issues with regards to the buyer's vesting. One of the hurdles that we see from an escrow officer perspective that could potentially delay closings focus around the signings. A lot of the times, if you're dealing with an international client, they might not be here accessible in Hawaii to do a notary in our offices or with a mobile notary. So we have to look at other options to figure out how to sign them. If you've dealt with a client before, you may be familiar with having to send them to an embassy or FedEx packages back and forth. So there's basically 3 ways that we can assist clients with signing paperwork. The blanket answer would be they can go to a U.S. embassy or consulate. By doing so, it's essentially like they're stepping onto U.S. soil essentially and signing, and they get a stamp and a notary, just like they would in the United States, or if they were to come to me, I would stamp and seal it as a notary. Those are generally accepted as documents that are accepted for recording at the Bureau of Conveyances. They're also accepted by the title officer. So kind of no questions asked if you go to a consulate or an embassy. The downside, I guess, with going to an embassy or consulate is it seems like since COVID, a lot of them now require you have to make an appointment online. A lot of times it could be weeks in advance before you actually get an appointment scheduled. So the tip with that is I would say, talk to your escrow officer, let the escrow officer know about any travel plans or sellers signing out of country as early in the transaction as possible, because oftentimes the escrow officer can work with you to maybe order the conveyance documents ahead of time, at least get those on there, and then you can actually work with your client to book those appointments, because the last thing you want is kind of wait to the last minute and then try and book an appointment, come to find out that the appointments aren't available for 2 or 3 weeks. Obviously, it's a little bit more difficult if the buyer is procuring a loan, because a lot of the times the closing documents are based on lender approval. But if you're dealing with the seller, it is good to try and get that booked as early as possible. Second option would be an apostille. So an apostille is essentially the client goes to a local notary within their country. That notary then presents it to the embassy or consulate for further authentication. So it's like a dual authentication of the notary. So the consulate's kind of approving the notary that was done locally. That's only available in certain instances for certain countries that have signed on to the Hague. for any of you that may have had Canadian clients in the past, I have some good news for you. Up until
Okay,
this
Jeremy.
year, yep,
Oh, Jeremy, sorry to interrupt. Can you talk a little bit louder? Your
sure.
microphone's just a little bit muted. Yeah, just give it a little more volume if you would. Thanks.
All right, let's see. So if you've dealt with any Canadian clients in the past, it was always an issue because they couldn't go to an apostille. They actually had to go to the consulate or the embassy, which in Canada is a very large country. A lot of times people weren't within driving distance, or even if they were, it was multiple hours to get to a local US embassy. Good news though is as of 2024, I think in January, they just signed on to The Hague. So that should allow them to now use the apostilles going forward. We just got some updates from our title staff about that. So that's good news. That should help for those Canadian clients who need signings. And then the newest option is what's called remote online notary. So during the COVID shutdown, with people working from home and not coming in person, the state of Hawaii actually passed some legislation that allowed remote online notary for recorded documents. So we have been partnering with some online companies, and we actually have some in-house approved remote online notary staff that can assist you. So what that does is allow somebody to meet remotely on a Zoom type call like this from anywhere in the world and notarize a client. There are some restrictions to that we have to keep in mind. So the person signing, the client, actually has to be a US citizen in order to qualify. So this works if they're traveling overseas. And then there's some limitations as far as I think the price point. So from an underwriter standpoint, they're going to want it. I think they don't want like really large transactions doing this. So there's, I think, a dollar threshold. But if that might be an option for you, I would just say check with your escrow officer going forward. A lot of things that we deal with are the funding, obviously. So buyers' money coming in and sellers' money going out. Working internationally, it's typically wires. So the biggest thing is wire fraud. We deal with that constantly, and I'll talk a little bit later about wire fraud and things you can do to protect your clients, because that's a big concern that we see right now with escrow transactions. So money coming in from buyers can be a wire, can be a cashier's check or a personal check. They must be drawn on US banks though. So you cannot accept checks that come in from a foreign bank, for example. And then from the seller's proceeds, it's basically the same stuff you would have on a regular transaction when dealing with a foreign seller. Typically, it'd probably be a wire transfer, and we can, again, wire overseas. One of the newest things that you might have seen recently on some title reports is something called FinCEN. This is kind of a new task that has been put on the title companies to collect information. The reason I bring this up is because if you're dealing with a foreign buyer, oftentimes they might put the property into an LLC or a corporation when doing so. But in doing so, there's going to be some additional paperwork that they're going to have to deal with. So you might be asking yourself, what is FinCEN? FinCEN is actually an acronym which stands for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And it's a bureau of the Department of Treasury. So basically their mission is to make sure that they're trying to combat money laundering and fraud during transactions. So ultimately what they're asking the title company to do is find out who the individuals are that are behind these companies. In the past, somebody could kind of buy a property with an LLC and you don't really know where the money's coming from. But they've now tasked the title companies to follow up on this information. So if certain parameters are met for reporting, then the the escrow officer will send some paperwork to the buyer asking them to complete it. It's going to ask for information. Well, before I tell you what they're asking for, there's a couple parameters that are required in order to report. So it has to be the sale of residential property. So vacant land is exempt. It has to be at least $300,000 or more. The buyer has to be an entity, so an LLC or a corporation. Does not include trust, which is good. The purchase has to be made with cash. If the buyer is buying a loan, we are not required to report because they're essentially relying on the bank to do the reporting. Now, if there's a hard money lender or the seller's doing some type of financing, then yes, we also have to report those instances because it's still kind of considered a cash transaction. And then as long as the funds are coming in via wire or money order or cash or virtual currency, which is essentially the only way we accept money anyway, then this geographic targeting order applies. And then the title company is required to ask the appropriate questions and obtain the appropriate information to report the sale of this transaction and the purchase by this particular entity. And then the last thing is that this property has to be in Hawaii. So they call it a geographic target order. And basically because there's certain areas in the country that have been deemed, I guess, kind of high risk for money laundering. And then they've identified those areas, and then only these areas have to do the extra reporting. So what is the Treasury asking for? So they're going to basically try and get down to the bottom to see who owns at least 25% or more of this entity that's purchasing the property. So they're going to ask for the percent interest of the ownership, the ID, date of birth, the tax ID number, address, and then the ownership. So they're actually going to look for an ID. The buyers or these individual owners have to provide an ID that goes along with the form. Again, they're going to look for LLCs, corporations, or partnerships. So these are what the Treasury is actually targeting. And basically, it's escrow's responsibility to ask the question. So we are going to work with title. Title's tasked to report it. Escrow will work with title to try and gather all that information from your client. So your clients will receive a package, and of course, escrow will be there every step of the way to answer the questions that go along with completing the forms. So they're not terribly difficult, but there might be a little bit back and forth with regards to additional information or some attachments that might be missing. But really, one of the things I want to talk about today was the trends that we are seeing towards fraud. Fraud is an increasingly bigger part of the responsibility from escrow companies and title companies, as well as it should be for brokerage and agents. To try and protect against fraud, you've probably seen different types of phishing attempts or attempts where people are impersonating you to try and get information from your clients or get them to redirect wires. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we see. And certainly this could affect your international clients. This is something that's affecting everybody across the industry. They're targeting the real estate industry because large amounts of money are being transacted every day across this country through title and escrow companies. Some of the types of fraud that we're going to talk about today are email, wire fraud, and then impersonation. So according to the FBI, email fraud in 2022 cost $2.2 billion taken by fraudsters all across the country. The next thing we'll talk about is wire fraud. In the past, fraudsters would try and manipulate the transaction or trick the escrow officer into diverting sellers' proceeds to a different account. Title and escrow companies quickly realized that we need to adapt and change our processes to verify wiring instructions so that we don't get tricked by the fraudsters. Fraudsters finally realized, okay, we can't trick the escrow companies anymore because they're on top of things. So now what they're doing is diverting their tactics, and they're trying to intercept or get to the buyers in a real estate transaction and convince the buyers that they might be the escrow company and maybe new wiring instructions are generated. And so use these new wiring instructions to send the proceeds. So they're going after the unsophisticated buyer who might only be relying on emails that come in. So that's something to keep in mind when working with your buyers. And I'll give you some tips a little bit on how to protect against that. And then the last thing is impersonation. So there's been a rise in people targeting vacant lands, purporting to be the sellers, selling those properties, and then taking the proceeds with the actual owner completely unaware. So I'll talk about a little bit about what we do to combat that. So business email compromise.
Jeremy,
Yep.
Jeremy, got about 4 minutes till Q&A.
Okay, sure.
Just
perfect.
the time.
Yep. So business email compromise The biggest thing I would say at this is when you talk to your client, make sure they know who's on the other side of the sending email. Just because it might say their escrow officer's name on the from line, make sure they hover over that to look to see what the hidden email is. In this case, you'll see that they changed Hawaii 2 eyes to exclamation points. This is a fraudulent email purporting to be from an escrow officer changing the wire amount. The biggest thing that I'd say you could take away from today is wired instructions. When dealing with title guarantee, we only deal with local banks, Bank of Hawaii, First Hawaiian Bank, CPB. If your client ever receives revised wiring instructions that mention a mainland bank, that is a huge red flag. Have them call your escrow officer. If you only take away one thing today, that's probably the biggest key. Phishing alerts from a brokerage or an agent, be vigilant. That's the only thing I can say. Fraudsters are attempting to infiltrate transactions by getting into the brokerage, emails, monitoring it, and then injecting themselves, pretending to be you at the right time to send wiring instructions to your buyer, looking like it's coming from you. So the only thing I would say with that is make sure your email securities are all up to date as best as possible. Again, this is things to know about email. I just verbally went over those. The last thing is this vacant land owner. So again, like I said, the sellers are being targeted. The fraudsters look for properties that are vacant and try and sell them. From an agent standpoint, what I would say is know your seller, have a phone call with them, get them on Zoom, be face-to-face. A lot of these sellers who do these fraudulent transactions, for whatever reason, say they're leaving the country, they got to rush it, they need the money real fast, so they'll sell it real low. They're not available or they don't have internet connection to do a video app. I mean, honestly, in today's world, everybody probably can get in front of a camera at some point. So those are all red flags. From an escrow standpoint and title standpoint, if we get a transaction that's vacant land, we are going to try and send a letter to the prior owner at an address that we know from the tax office records, perhaps, letting them know like, hey, did you actually mean to sell this property? And we've actually caught a few of those where the actual seller reached out to us and said, no, I'm not selling this property. And we're like, okay, well, we got a contract. So we know at that point, it's an illegitimate transaction. So, you know, just be vigilant with regards to that. And then on those transactions, this is a list of, these might be actual notaries, but we have found that these people, notaries were used fraudulently in various transactions. So this is just like a list that we keep internally, and you know, we share it with people because we know that they're fraudulent transactions. So be wary if we ever have notaries with these people. But yeah, basically the thing is, fraud is huge. Be vigilant, know your seller, and then wiring instructions, protect your buyer. Make sure that they speak to your escrow officer. Make sure they verbally confirm. Don't rely on emails with regards to wire. And with that, I am done and I'll hand it over.
Awesome.
Love to take any questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you very much. And then Jeremy, you can stop sharing. Yep. And then Brad, can you come back on and we'll do a little bit of Q&A. So we've got about 15 minutes. So Brad, let's start with you. There's a couple questions. I'm going to try to summarize some of these. First question, is it better to start the exemption process before entering escrow or after? And then approximately how long does it take to get the exemption from Harpta?
Oh yeah, no, that's good. Usually what we tell our, you know, if people talk to us prior to them accepting an offer, I tell them as soon as you accept an offer, give us a call, because, you know, if you're eligible for a waiver, you know, we can start the wheels in motion. There is a deadline to file of no later than 10 business days prior to the close of your sale. So that's business days. So just be aware of that.
And how long does the process generally take?
Yeah, you know, it really depends. You know, during the busy time of year for the tax department, like we're coming up, you know, during the March, April time frame, it may take maybe 6, 7, 8 days. But recently, we've been seeing turnarounds of 1 or 2 days, you know, for the applications for the waivers.
Okay, and is there any exemption you can file for Firpta?
For Firpta, it's really hard. Here's the thing: is the problem with Firpta is that they're still really, really slow in getting an answer to the home sellers, and a lot of times the money isn't withheld in state. It's as soon as closing is done, and Jeremy can probably confirm. Most escrow companies will just send that directly to the IRS right after escrow. So it can be really difficult. It's kind of hit and miss with the IRS.
Okay. All right. And then Jeremy, you talked about the remote online notary. Is this something that can also be used for domestic purchasers, someone in California or New York purchasing?
Yeah, that is something that can be used domestically as well. Obviously, it has a huge impact for international because it alleviates going to a consulate and setting up those appointments, but it can be used domestically. So if that's an option, just speak with your escrow officer and they can help with that.
Okay. And then Jeremy, is an ITIN required when someone is purchasing property, a foreigner purchasing property in Hawaii?
So generally, to purchase, no. So we wouldn't require anything. The only exception I think with that would be is if it qualifies for one of those geographic targeting orders, because they'd have to complete the forms and then put the ID numbers and provide photo IDs. But if it doesn't qualify for that, from an escrow standpoint, we wouldn't require anything. Certainly from a seller standpoint, I think as Brad mentioned earlier, they want to have an ITIN because I don't think you can actually apply for the refunds and everything unless you have that. So typically from escrow, we will send them forms to assist with the application process if they haven't already done so. We can in theory close, but in order for Brad to process the refund, they're gonna need to have an ITIN in place, or at least I think you said at least show that the application has been filed. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And thank you for that. And Brad, coming back to you, what happens if there's not enough proceeds from the sale to withhold for Harpta Firpta? What happens in that scenario?
Unfortunately, we see this situation from time to time. It's not something that happens frequently, but it does happen. But when it does happen, when the seller is being told that they need to bring cash to closing just to be able to close because they don't have sufficient equity to be able to cover, all of the Harpta that's withheld, you can actually apply for a reduction. This is the one instance where Hawaii will allow for a Harpta reduction. Rather, it's a complete waiver or it's Harpta at full amount. But this is the one instance where Hawaii will sometimes allow for a reduction such that the person wouldn't have to actually bring cash to closing. It's reduced just to that point, but not any more than that. So yeah, it is possible to get Harpta reduced.
Yeah.
Okay. And how about Firpta? And that's, oh, sorry, Jeremy, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say escrow can assist with providing the application forms for that so that they can apply during the escrow process to hopefully get their answer for a reduced amount. As Brad said, it might come back saying rather than the 7.25% or whatever, it could be 3% or a flat dollar amount they might tell us to collect or withhold. So
exactly,
we can assist with that.
Mm-hmm. And Brad, what about Firpta? Is there any hope of any kind of reduction for that?
Not recently. We've been seeing some progress in the IRS. I mean, they've been getting more funding. And just recently, I managed a client that had Firpta withheld for a year and a half. I recently was able to get actually a video meeting with an IRS agent in Nevada, and we are actually able to kind of get that solved. But you know what? It's still kind of hit or miss with the IRS. I think this year we're going to start. Last year we kind of were telling people, what, Firpta, we're not really doing much, only because we don't want to get people disappointed because they're just waiting and waiting. We don't have any answers for them. But this year we're kind of watching the progress and seeing if this is something we want to jump into again.
Okay. And then Jeremy, coming back to you, if someone is applying for their Harpta exhibit, but they haven't received it yet, how long will escrow hold funds after closing and waiting for that to come through?
Yeah, each company I think would probably have their own procedures. I know for us, like we would distribute it on the day of recordation, so we wouldn't hold things post closing. So either you need to have the approval in hand or an acknowledgement of the reduction amount in hand prior to closing. Otherwise, we would remit it all, and then they'd have to apply an N288E to get it back post closing.
Okay. And Brad, coming back to you, if there are two owners on a property, one is a resident of Hawaii, one is not. I guess that could also apply to a resident of Hawaii and a foreign person. How is then Harpta and Firpta treated?
Okay, so in the case of in the case of well in the case of Firpta, let's get Firpta first. So Firpta, in the case of the Hawaii person, I'm assuming that the Hawaii person is a citizen, U.S. citizen. So
Let's just make it easy. Yes.
yeah, they wouldn't have any Firpta withheld. The foreign person would have Firpta withheld. Same way with Harpta. If there are two owners, you would have to look at the residency of the owner, each individual owner. And if the individual owner is not a resident, then they would be subject to Harpta unless they can get a waiver by applying for one.
Okay. All right. And then Jeremy, what you've seen from the escrow standpoint on this Firpta and Harpta, is there any advice you have for buyers and sellers as they head into escrow?
I would just say start early. As Brad mentioned, as soon as escrow is open, have those conversations with CPA or individual like Brad to get that ball rolling. The last thing you want to do, and unfortunately sometimes this happens, is right at close and, oh yeah, I got this Harpta thing, I want to apply. And then as Brad said, you have to do it 10 business days beforehand. Escrow needs to answer, by the time we close, otherwise we're going to disperse. So that's probably the biggest thing that you could do, is just early and often, and work with a professional to do that.
Okay. And Brad, coming back to you for a non-resident, if they're holding the property in a Hawaii LLC, does that provide exemption under Harpta and Firpta?
It might. I talked a little bit earlier about certain types of entities that wouldn't be allowed for it. Any kind of an LLC that is taxed as a sole proprietor or a sole proprietorship itself. Those types of entities. You look past the the registration of the entity, and you look to the residency of the actual owner of the company itself. But absent that, I mean, if it was, say, a LLC that is taxed as an S corp, or an LLC that's taxed as a partnership, those types of entities, if they're registered to do business in Hawaii, generally speaking, they should be allowed to get a Harpta waiver by just checking the box that yes, I am a resident, and they should be subject to an exemption, immediate exemption.
Okay. Okay,
yeah,
great.
Patrick, I
yes,
would add one thing. A lot of times agents or clients would ask escrow, like, oh, am I exempt? The standard response would be escrow cannot advise. We take in the forms, and if the form is checked, it's not for us to say whether or not somebody is exempt or not. The only thing we would do is share that with the buyer, because ultimately the collection of Harpta and Firpta essentially falls on the buyer via escrow. I think maybe once in 20 years have I ever seen a buyer reject a Harpta certification that was declared as resident, because the buyer says, no, I know that seller. I know for a fact he's not a resident of Hawaii, and then ask escrow to collect and withhold. But barring that, escrow doesn't really get involved as to determining whether or not somebody is exempt or not, other than we present the forms and collect the forms and pass them on to the buyer.
Brad, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things I tell our clients is that escrow is not the tax cops, and we're not the tax cops either. So, of course, if we know something about a client, we can't dispute that in our filings. We have to be consistent throughout. But yeah, escrow isn't in charge of being tax cops, nor should they be held to that responsibility. So yeah, it's up to the buyer to police it.
Okay. And then Brad, maybe a question for both of you. A buyer is heading into this, they're non-resident, but they're going to do a 1031 exchange. Is that automatic exemption from Harpta and Firpta?
Jeremy, you want to take the first stab at it? You want me to jump in?
From a seller standpoint, like if the sellers, because Harpta would be on the seller side, not the buyer side. But if they're selling the property, then yeah, they could. I think they check box 2 and indicate IRS code 1031 as a reasoning for being exempt.
Yeah.
And they would be exempt from Harpta and Firpta for
Yeah.
those reasons.
You know, if you've ever looked at the N289 that Jeremy referenced, it's there are 3 boxes, and the second box is for something called non-recognition provisions. And if you check that box and you put the applicable code, you know, IRS code for you know, the 1031 exchanges, you should be able to get an immediate waiver. This I should add though, if you pull any cash out of the transaction, you know, even small amount, 10,000, even 1,000. You pull any cash out of the transaction, you have any sort of what they call taxable boot. What happens is that Harpta is going to be withheld on the entire amount of the relinquished property. It's not for only, you know, 7.25% of that boot that you took out of the transaction, but the entire amount. So just keep that in mind. It's probably best to try to sink all of those proceeds into the replacement property if you can.
Okay, and this is kind of a follow-up to it. If someone has checked the box 1031 exchange, the funds do go to the intermediary, but ultimately they don't purchase a property. Have you come across that, and what impact would that have?
Yeah, that's a great point because we run into this situation quite a bit, and I've had discussions with Julie Bratton about this because, you know, this happens from time to time, right? Somebody just can't find a replacement property. So what happens is that it's actually at that point, because you're far removed from the escrow process, you've actually closed it out. It's actually the QI's responsibility to do the withholding at that point. Or no, you know what? I take that back. It's not really the QI's responsibility, but it's really kind of the QI's responsibility to at least inform the seller that, you know what, this didn't happen, so now you're responsible for paying Harpta. And you know, I've told Julie, if you refer people like that to us, you know, we'll take care of them and we'll do the filing for them. But yeah, the seller at that point with a failed 1031, they're going to be subject, you know, they're going to be subject to that 7.25%.
I see. Did you want to add anything, Jeremy?
Nope. Yep.
Okay.
Totally.
All right. And Brad, coming back to you, in the scenario where there is a Hawaii resident here, they pass on and the property is going through probate, but all of the beneficiaries live elsewhere, mainland or international. Would that type of a sale be exempt from Harpta Firpta?
Well, that would really depend. First of all, I should make clear that the residency status of the beneficiaries really usually don't count. If anything, the residency status of the fiduciaries or the trustees would matter. Beneficiaries, their residency doesn't really count for anything. But I think that would matter if the deceased had a trust or if they passed without a trust. If they passed without a trust, then an estate would be formed, and that estate, the residency of the estate, would be the residency of the person who passed on you know, when they passed. And so, if that person passed as a Hawaii resident and the estate is formed, then yeah, that estate is going to be able to check off box 1 in that Harpta or the N289 and yeah, get an immediate waiver of Harpta by being a resident. However, if it's a trust, then you have to look at the, you know, the residency status of the fiduciaries and also where the administrative work for the trust is actually done.
Yes. Okay. I'm just going to add one more scenario that happened to us. Actually, several times. We've had foreign purchasers who have purchased the property in one name, which is different than their U.S. passport name, right? They use their foreign documentation. Yeah, exactly. Which creates a really big issue. So just be careful if you're dealing with international clients that they're purchasing and selling underneath the same ID. There's a lot more questions. We could go on for a long time, but Jeremy and Brad, you've been fantastic today. For anyone who's watching this, I highly recommend you contact these two if you have specific questions. They both have been very generous with their time when I call them. They're top of the game. They've got all the answers, especially on the really complicated Harpta Firpta. Give Brad a call. You can tell, you know, he's got it all going on. So with that, thank you again very much, gentlemen, and a big thank you to Guaranteed Rate Leonard Leventhal for sponsoring today. And if you want to take advantage of that, the high RIC membership for $30 and you're a guest, please reach out to Wendy. You can reach out to me. We'll make sure we set you up with that. So until next time, be well, be safe, and aloha. See you guys.
Thank you.